The first thing Cassia Vane did the morning the merchant came to buy her land was break the ice in the water bucket with the heel of her husband's boot, because her own hands had gone too stiff to manage the dipper. The bucket had skinned over solid in the night, a gray disk of ice an inch thick, and she stood over it in the blue dark before the sun, her breath tearing sideways off the corner of the collapsed soddy, and she hit it twice, and felt the cold of the prairie come up through the cracked soles of her boots and settle into her like something that meant to stay. She was 23 years old, and she had been a widow for 9 weeks. And out on the frozen road from Cedar Reach, a mile off across the drifted shortgrass, a black buggy was already coming. If you are new here, welcome to Winter Whispers. Settle in, pull a quilt close, and subscribe, because this is the story of a young woman who was left the coldest building on the open Dakota prairie, a thing the whole town swore was worthless, and what she did with it when the killing blizzard came down. Her husband, Elias, had died in October of the lung fever, 3 days of it, coughing into a rag by the stove until he stopped, and they had buried him in the hard ground at the bend of the creek before the first real snow. He had left her the quarter section, the leaning barn, a debt of $41 owed at the depot for seed and coal, and one white and tan goat named Juniper with a single floppy left ear who followed her everywhere and rang her little iron bell against the wind. The town had been kind in the way towns are kind to a young widow, which is to say they had brought her a covered dish and a great deal of pity, and then begun, gently, to talk about when she would give up. The buggy belonged to Otis Crail, who owned the grain depot and the coal and most of the paper in the settlement, and he had decided what she would do before she had. She watched him come. She did not go inside. She stood by the broken water bucket in her late husband's olive-brown greatcoat, with the sleeves turned back twice, the brass wedding band cold against her breastbone, and behind her, half buried in the south slope of the low ground, sat the one building Otis Crail would not so much as name in his offer. The ice house, a thick mounded hump of fieldstone and sod dug into the rise, its double walls packed once with sawdust, its low plank door drifted to the latch with snow. Elias had built it the first summer to hold creek ice through the heat, blocks cut in February and packed in damp sawdust so they would have cold butter and milk in August, and it was the soundest thing on the whole homestead and the most useless thing on it now, in January, when the world was already ice and no man living wanted to buy a building made to stay cold. Crail would offer for the land. He would not offer a penny for the ice house, and that, though she did not yet know it, was the first mistake he made. He came up the rise red-faced and pleased with himself, a heavy man of 50 in a good bottle green frock coat and fur-collared overcoat, a tall brown bowler and a silver-headed cane he did not need, and he did not get down from the buggy at first, only looked out over her quarter section the way a man looks at a thing he already owns. "Mrs. Vane," he said. "Bitter morning to be standing about." She said it was. He told her, with the warm regret of a man enjoying himself, that he had been thinking on her situation, on the debt and the long winter and a young woman alone so far out, and that he was prepared to be more than fair. He named a figure. It was less than half what Elias had paid for the raw claim 4 years before, and it would clear the $41 and leave her a little to take the train east to whatever people she had left. He said it kindly. That was the thing about Otis Crail that the town never quite saw. He was not a cruel man so much as a man who had decided, long ago, that he was a reasonable one, that whatever he wanted was therefore the reasonable thing, and that anyone who refused him was being difficult against their own interest. He spread the offer out like a man laying down a winning hand and waited for her to be grateful. Cassia looked at the figure in the cold and thought about February, about the barrel of potatoes still banked in the soddy and the goat that gave milk yet, and she thought, in a small, clear voice underneath the grief, that a man who offered you charity and your own ruin in the same breath was telling you exactly how little he thought the thing was worth, and that the moment a man like Otis Crail told you a thing was worthless was a very good moment to look hard at the thing. "And the ice house?" she asked. He laughed. He could not help it. It came up out of him round and genuine, the laugh of a sensible man at a foolish question. "The ice house," he said, "was a hole in a hill. Mrs. Vain, a summer building, no good to any soul in the dead of winter, and a fool's labor to keep up. He would not insult her by pricing it. He would, he said generously, throw it in." And there it was. Cassia did not answer him about the land. She thanked him for coming so far in the cold, which was not the same as no, and was not yes. And she watched the small, pale blue eyes go flat with the irritation of a reasonable man made to wait. And he gathered his cane and told her to think hard and not too long, because an offer was a living thing and would not keep. And he turned the buggy in the snow and went back down the rise to tell whoever would listen about the widow Vain, who could not see sense. By noon the whole settlement knew the figure he had named and the answer she had not given. And by the time the light went blue that afternoon, they knew the rest of it too. Because Cassia Vain had spent the short day not packing her dead husband's house, but standing inside the cold dark of the ice house with a lantern, running her bare, chapped hand along the inner wall, feeling how the deep fieldstone held the small heat of her own body and breath, and would not let it go. Marie Holloway came out the next morning through the snow, a broad, kind, weathered woman of 40 in a long black hooded cloak and a faded blue calico bonnet, with a basket of eggs she could not really spare, and a worry she could not hide, and she found Casa at the ice house. And what Cassia was doing made her set the basket down in the snow and press her mittened knuckles to her mouth. Cassia had a spade. She was digging out the drift from the low plank door, and when Merritt asked her, the way you ask a grieving person whether they have slept, what she meant to do, Cassia straightened and looked at her with steady hazel green eyes and said she meant to winter in it. There was a silence with only the wind in it. Merritt said, gently, that it was an ice house, dear, made to be cold. And Cassia said yes. That was exactly the point. Merritt did not understand. Not then. And she was too kind to laugh. But the men who heard it from her by evening were not so kind. And the next afternoon 3 of them rode out with Otis Crail and stood in a loose, grinning half-circle in the snow to watch the widow Vain try to keep house in a hole built to make ice. Tobias Crail came too, the merchant's grown son, a tall, lean, sandy-haired young man of 25, with his father's pale eyes and none of his father's certainty, and Tobias did not grin. He stood a little apart, with his hands jammed in the pockets of his worn brown overcoat and a misery on his weak-chinned face, and when his father said loudly that a body might as well try to warm a well or set up housekeeping in a grave, Tobias would not look at her at all. They laughed. Who winters in an ice house, Crail wanted to know, turning to his men, who keeps warm in the one building on God's earth dug and walled and packed at great expense for the sole purpose of staying cold? It was the funniest thing the settlement had heard all that grim winter, and for a week the joke of Cedar Reach was the widow on the rise who was going to freeze to death proving a point. Cassia let them laugh and go. She had stopped, by then, hearing them very clearly. She was inside the cold dark with the lantern and the goat, thinking, and what she was thinking she said aloud to Juniper, because there was no one else, and the goat was warm against her side, and the little iron bell rang soft when the doe turned her head. They're looking at what it was made for, she told the goat, scratching the floppy left ear. They aren't looking at how it's made. She laid her hand flat on the inner wall. 2 feet of fieldstone and sod and packed sawdust, then an airspace, then more stone. A wall thick enough that the summer sun beat on it all day in August, and could not push its heat through to the ice in the dark heart of the mound, and Cassia, turning the thin brass ring on its cord, understood the thing the whole laughing town had missed. A wall that good at keeping the August heat out of a cold room would be exactly that good at keeping a winter heat in. The ice house did not care which way the warmth ran. It only knew how to hold. It had been built to fight the sun. She would turn it around and make it fight the wind. She began the next morning and worked like something with a fixed star to steer by, and it was the kind of work that warms you while you do it. The first warmth she had felt since October. First, the shell. She went over the outer mound bent double against the wind and packed it deeper still. More sod cut in frozen squares from the lee of the barn and stacked against the south face. Straw forked thick over the whole hump and weighted with old fence rails so the wind would not strip it, until the building hunched lower into the rise like an animal settling to sleep. A drift over the mound was another blanket now, and she banked the snow up the north wall herself with the spade and let the weather help her. Then, the door. The single low-plank door let the cold straight in every time it opened, so she did not fight it. She defeated it. She built a second wall of stacked sod, a long stride inside the first, offset so that a body coming in passed through a short, dark elbow of a passage, a cold trap that turned twice so the wind could find no straight run at the warm room, and the heat could not pour out the door in a gust. She hung an old buffalo robe across the inner mouth of it for good measure, and then, in the long blue afternoons, she did the clever thing. The thing none of them had imagined a young widow could so much as picture, let alone lay up in stone with her own chapped and bleeding hands. She salvaged the collapsed soddy down to its bones, the field stone of the old chimney, a stack of hard brick Elias had freighted out and never used. Flat creek stones she pried from the frozen bank, and stone by stone she began to build a heat channel through the thick inner wall. Not a stove throwing its warmth at the ceiling and losing it, not an open fire eating wood she did not have. A serpentine flue. A low firebox set at floor level just inside the cold trap, its mouth a careful arch of brick, and from it a snaking masonry duct that she ran horizontally into and along the great thick inner wall, doubling back on itself twice, a slow stone S laid into the very mass of the wall built to hold cold, so that the hot smoke from a small banked fire would not rush straight up and out, but would crawl the whole long stone path, giving up its heat into the fieldstone the entire way. Before it ever found the short chimney she set at the far end. She bedded each stone in a mud and ash mortar she mixed from the unfrozen creek clay and worked with her bare fingers because mitts could not feel a true joint. She checked the draw with a twist of smoking straw and adjusted and cursed once, softly, the way Elias used to, and built it again where it did not draw. The longer the smoke traveled, the more heat it gave up to the stone, and the stone would hold it the way these same walls had once held the cold of winter ice, all through the killing heat of August. Walls thick enough to keep a thing frozen, she told Juniper while she worked, are thick enough to keep a thing warm. The bell on the goat's collar gave its small iron note, and Cassia took it for agreement and bent again to the stone. She built the firebox low and tight at the mouth of the flue, a squat little hearth of the hardest stone she had, with an iron grate salvaged from the dead stove laid across the bottom so the embers could breathe and the ash could fall. And she sized it small on purpose, small enough that one careful fire of creek bank peat and split cordwood would not roar itself out in an hour, but would sit and glow and feed the stone slow all through the night. The peat she had cut herself in the autumn, before her husband took his fever, squares of it dug from the boggy creek margin and stacked to dry under the leaning barn, and she had thought then she was a fool for it, and knew now she had been wise without knowing it. She stacked the dry bricks by the firebox mouth within reach of a kneeling hand. Then she finished the door, caulking the seams of the planks with twisted straw rope soaked in clay, and hanging a second door inside the first. An old quilt stretched on a salvaged frame, so no single gust could ever reach the warm chamber at the heart. She banked the outer wall higher, with sod and heaped loose straw over it and snow over the straw. Because she had learned from the drifts themselves that snow piled deep is not the enemy of warmth, but a blanket. That the prairie hares slept warm in their snow burrows while men froze in their clapboard shanties. And she meant to sleep as warm as a hare. By the time the short day failed, she had laid in her provisions against the walls where the new warmth would keep them from freezing. The crocks of lard and the salt pork in brine, the strings of dried apples and onions, the sacks of cornmeal, the barrel of potatoes banked round with straw, and the goat tethered loose in her clean-bedded corner where her body heat would add its might to the fires. And her milk would come warm into the pail at morning and night. Then, in the blue last light, with her hands raw and her braid come half loose and her late husband's coat heavy with the day's labor, Cassia Vane knelt at the little firebox and laid her first fire. She built it small the way she had built everything: a handful of dry grass, a teepee of split kindling, 2 squares of peat, and she struck the flint and steel and coaxed the spark into the grass and breathed on it the way you breathe on something you love and are afraid to lose. And the flame caught and stood up gold in the dark chamber, and the smoke went where she had taught it, drawn low and slow along the serpentine stone, doubling through the thick wall, giving up its heat to rock at every turn before it slipped out into the freezing night. She fed it a brick of peat and banked the embers close and sat back on her heels and waited. And the stone warmed, slow at first, a thing you doubt before you feel it, and then sure, the cold breath of the old ice house giving way grudging, and then all at once to a held and living heat that came up out of the wall itself and laid itself on her chapped face like a hand. Juniper sighed and folded her legs and lay down in the straw, fed and calm and safe. Cassia put her raw hands toward the warm stone and felt the heat come into them. And she did not weep, because she had wept herself dry months ago. But something in her chest that had been frozen since the fever took him came loose and ran warm. And she understood that she had done it. That the coldest building on the whole homestead was now the warmest place for a mile in any direction, built with her own 2 hands out of the very thing the town had called worthless. They saw the smoke, of course. The next morning, the thin gray thread of it stood up from the low sod mound where no smoke had any business standing, and the men of Cedar Reach laughed the way men laugh at a thing they have already decided is foolish, before they have troubled to understand it. Otis Krill rode out himself and sat his horse at the edge of her yard and looked at the smoking mound, and his ruddy jowls shook with it. "Living in your icebox, are you?" he called to her, his small pale blue eyes merry with contempt. She would be froze to a board by Candlemas, he told the town after, and then her quarter section would go for the back taxes and the debts, and he would have it for the pennies he had always meant to pay. Marit Holloway came too, and she stood in the cold trap between the 2 doors, with her mittened hands pressed to her mouth, and felt the warmth come off the inner quilt and said, "Oh child, oh Cassia." It's warm. It's truly warm in here. But her gladness was edged with fear, because she did not understand it, and a thing not understood is a thing the prairie distrusts. And Tobias Crale stood a little apart and looked at the clever low firebox and the serpentine stone the way a decent man looks at a thing his father has mocked, and he said nothing and looked away ashamed. The town laughed harder when the deep cold came in and the smoke still stood up steady morning after morning. "Let her play at it," they said, and the days drew down toward the dark of January, and the sky went from pewter to a low, dirty yellow gray that the old hands did not like, and the wind that never stopped changed its note. It came down out of the north in the last week of January, the great killing blizzard, the one they would mark the years by after, fast on the heel of a false warm hour. The yellow-gray sky lowered until it sat on the drifts, and the first snow came not falling, but flying, driven flat across the open prairie on a wind that rose in an afternoon from a breeze to a shriek. By dark there was no prairie and no sky and no town, only the whiteout, the screaming blue-gray nothing where a man could not see his own outstretched hand, and where the cold was no longer a discomfort, but a hunting thing that killed. It snowed 3 days. The settlement of Cedar Reach was pinned flat under it. The stock that had not been got into shelter froze standing in the open, found after, as humped white shapes along the fence lines. The clapboard shanties leaked the wind through every seam, and the families huddled under every quilt they owned and fed their little stoves until the fuel ran low. The merchant Crail's coal ran short, the coal he sold dear to the whole town, because the storm had come early, and the cars had not come up the spur, and even hoarded it would not last the 3 days. The proud white frame meeting house could not hold heat in a gale. Its thin walls and high windows let the warmth out as fast as the stove could make it, and the few who sheltered there shivered and prayed and grew afraid. And on the open trail between Cedar Reach and the railhead, travelers were caught, a freighter and his team, a family in a wagon, bound for a claim. Strangers who knew the country not at all, and they lost the road in the white and would have died as so many died in those years. Except that across the drowned white world there stood one light, one steady warm gold light, low to the ground on the south rise, where the smoke of a small, banked fire still rose unbeaten into the storm, because it was sheltered deep in stone and sod and snow. And the firebox glowed out through the one little draft hole and lay a small gold stain on the blowing snow that could be seen, just barely seen, by a lost and freezing eye that had given up on seeing anything ever again. They came to it. They came stumbling through the whiteout 1 and 2 at a time, drawn to the only warmth on the prairie the way the cold itself had once been drawn into those walls, and the widow they had laughed at heard them at her plank door over the scream of the wind. Marit came first. Marit Holloway and her 2 children, the 3 of them roped together and frost-rhymed and barely standing, because she had dared the 1/4 mile from her own failing shanty on nothing but faith and the memory of heat against her mittened hands. Cassia took them in through the cold trap, one door shut before the other opened, no gust reaching the warm heart, and she sat them at the firebox and put goat's milk warm from the evening pail into the children's blue hands, and laid the buffalo robe over Merritt's shaking shoulders, and Merritt looked at the glowing serpentine stone and wept and could not speak. Then came strangers off the trail, the freighter half dead and led by a boy, then the Claim family, the man carrying a child inside his coat, all of them having seen that one impossible gold stain on the storm and turned toward it as toward the last mercy in the world, and Cassia brought each of them in through the baffle and fed them salt pork sizzled hot on the firebox stone and cornmeal mush and warm milk. And the chamber she had built for one widow and one goat held them, and the heat off the stone did not fail. Then, late on the second night, when the chamber was full of warming saved people and the storm was at its worst, there came a different knocking at the plank door, a heavy, desperate, failing knock, and Cassia opened the cold trap, and Tobias Crail half fell through it, ice in his sandy hair and his weak chin shaking, and behind him, leaning on him, frost rimed and broken and gray in the face, his fine overcoat gone stiff with ice, and his silver-headed cane lost somewhere in the drifts, came Otis Crail himself. The merchant who had laughed, the man who had called it her icebox and waited for her to freeze. His coal had run out, and his fine house had gone cold around him, and his proud bulk had not saved him any more than his money had, and his son had got him out into the killing white, and aimed them both at the one warm light, because there was nowhere else to go, and now he stood swaying in the cold trap of the building he had mocked, at the mercy of the woman whose land he had meant to take for pennies, and he could not meet her eyes. Cassia Vane looked at him a long moment in the gold light. She did not gloat. There was nothing in her steady hazel-green gaze of the thing he would have had in his had it gone the other way. She simply stood back and held the inner quilt aside and said, "Come in out of the cold. Mr. Crail, there's room and there's warmth." And she took him in. She sat the broken merchant down on a sack of cornmeal by the very firebox he had laughed at, pressed a cup of hot goat's milk into his shaking gloved hands, and warmed him salt pork on the stone of the heat channel she had built out of the rocks of her dead husband's fallen wall. And she fed him, and his son, and the strangers, and the children, and Merritt, all of them packed warm into the glowing chamber, while the blizzard screamed itself hoarse against 3 feet of stone and sod and snow, and could not get in. The goat Juniper lay calm in her straw through all of it, and the children put their cold hands in her warm coat, and the bell rang soft, and that small sound under the great roar of the storm was the sound of life going on where it had no business going on at all. So the worthless ice house held the begging town alive. 3 days the blizzard blew, and 3 days the gold light did not fail, and the widow they had laughed at kept them all, the kind and the cruel alike, warm and fed and breathing by the glow of the clever fire, until on the 4th morning the wind dropped into a vast and ringing silence, and the storm broke. They came out of the plank door one by one into a world made new and terrible and beautiful. The sky had washed itself to a high, pale winter blue, and a thin sun stood low and cold over a prairie drowned to the fence tops in unbroken white, every drift carved smooth and shining. The bare cottonwoods along the creek hung with ice and lit like glass, and they were alive to see it. Every soul that had stumbled to her door across those 3 killing days walked out into that pale morning alive, went out across the white, the humped shapes of frozen stock, and the buried shanties told what would have come to them otherwise. The reckoning, when it came, was quiet, the way the best reckonings are quiet. Otis Crail stood in the snow before the low gold-lit mound he had mocked, and he was an old man suddenly. And he turned his bowler in his hands the way a man does who has run out of bluster, and he said to her, in front of the whole saved and gathered settlement, that he withdrew his offer for her land, that it had been a low and shameful offer and he was ashamed of it, that she would keep her quarter section, and that if she ever sold it, which he did not think she would, it would be at an honest price and to an honest man, and that he was not sure he had been either, until a woman of 23 he had laughed at had fed him salt pork by the fire she built out of a thing he called worthless. And the town that had laughed now stood in the bright cold and looked at the smoking ice house the way you look at a marvel, because that is what it was, and they did not call it her icebox anymore. They called it the warm house. They called her a wonder. Merritt Holloway took both of Cassia's raw, chapped hands in her mittened ones and could not say what she meant to and did not need to. And Tobias Crail, who had looked away ashamed when his father laughed, looked at her now full and steady, and there was something in it that the spring might one day make more of. But that is another story, and a gentler one. Cassia Vane stood in the door of her warm house, with the goat's bell ringing soft behind her, and the thin sun on her wind-chapped face, and the brass wedding band warm now against her chest. And she thought, in her quiet way, on the things she had learned and the things she had become. The cold building everyone discarded had held, in its thick, stubborn walls, the most warmth of any place for miles. The thing they all swore was useless had saved every one of them. It had only ever needed someone to look at it not for what it had always been, but for what it could be turned to, someone stubborn and clever and grieved enough to have nothing left to lose by trying. And she understood, standing there, that the ice house was not the only thing in that story made to be discarded and proved instead to hold the most warmth of all. She was the widow they had pitied and laughed at and meant to buy out for pennies, and she had held them all alive through the killing dark, and she was not worthless and never had been. She kept the homestead. She kept the goat with the one floppy ear and the small iron bell. She kept the warm house on the south rise, and through the rest of that long winter and the winters after, when the dark came down and the wind rose to its shriek, there was always one steady gold light low on the Dakota prairie where the cold had been turned to warmth, and any soul lost and freezing in the white knew they could come to her plank door. Close your eyes a moment and see it as it was that last evening. The ice house glowing gold against the deep blue winter dusk, the smoke standing thin and steady into the still air, the snow beginning again soft and slow and harmless now, falling on a refuge that had won, on a woman who had been proved, on the small warm light that the coldest place had been hiding all along. If this story warmed you the way that fire warmed them, stay close, pull your quilt nearer, and let the snow fall soft outside your window. Subscribe to Winter Whispers for more quiet stories of cold places that turned out to hold the most warmth of all.